When I responded to Dimitri Monroe, who self-identifies as a
cross-dressing anime boy.
I've got a lot of backlash for urging my viewers not to make fun of his gender nonconformity and for specifying that this is a pro-LGBT channel. I don't care about losing subscriptions from bitter gamers that have been brainwashed into hating transgender people by alt-right grifters, but I do care about debunking the intellectually dishonest arguments those grifters rely on. So, in this video I will double down on my stance by providing my thoughts on transgender science and why I think that the transphobia that's currently happening in the US and UK is stupid and evil. I also think that this topic is appropriate for my channel, as I usually focus on the Dark Souls series, which has a canonically transgender character. When people say that gender is a social construct, they mean that the societal rules for how a person of a specific gender is supposed to act, and even how societies decide if you belong to a certain gender, vary from culture to culture. It's not an objective fact of the universe that everyone that is born with a penis will be recognized as a man by their society. This idea is mostly found in Judeo-Christian cultures that believe that God created Adam and Eve and that anything outside of this strict gender binary is blasphemous. The world of Dark Souls does not know about the story of the Garden of Eden, so they came up with a different, more natural way of assigning gender. Gwyndolin was born with male genitalia, but as she had a feminine soul, she was recognized to be a girl, which is reminiscent of some Native American cultures that also naturally allowed transgender people to live as their preferred gender.
A boy who behaved like a girl before he participated in the boys' puberty ceremonies in the Mojave Nation would be considered for the transvestite ceremony. Expressing interest in dolls, the domestic work of women, women's gambling games, and inquiring about the female skirt were all ways a boy may be considered for the transvestite ceremony. Before the ceremony, relatives would try to dissuade him, but if the boy persists, they would assist in the preparations for the ceremony. The ceremony itself was meant to surprise the boy. It was a test of willingness. Other nearby settlements would receive word to come and watch. A circle of onlookers would sing special songs. The boy danced like a woman. It confirmed his status as an Aliha. He was then taken to a river to bathe and was given a skirt to wear. The ceremony would permanently change his gender status within the nation. He then took up a female name. The men who changed their identity usually dressed as women and changed their hairstyle and tattooing pattern. They also acted as women, adopting their manners and gestures, even adjusting their voices accordingly.
Similarly, adulthood is also a social construct. Sure, biologically people do age and become mature, but it's not a biological fact that everyone who's 18 will be recognized as an adult by their society. In some cultures, that age is set at 21, but in others, adulthood is based on other factors like going through a rite of passage, for example by killing a lion. Therefore, adulthood is a social construct, because someone that's recognized to be an adult in one culture is not necessarily one in another culture. This status depends on the culture this person resides in. The same is also true for gender. A transgender person can be seen as a woman in one society, but as a man or even a third gender by another society. It's not an objective fact that someone's gender has to be based on birth sex, as different cultures throughout history assign gender in different ways. Gender as a concept is a social construct because different cultures have different genders to recognize, with different societal rules on how they are supposed to act, and a different way of assigning these genders. But that's not to be confused with someone's gender identity being entirely socially constructed. Gender identity, or what gender someone wants to identify as, is an innate feeling that you are born with. Here's a thought experiment. Let's say you take a newborn baby and give it a sex change at birth and raise it as the other gender. Do you think this child would just accept its new gender, or do you think it would innately know that it was born as the other sex? According to anti-trans logic, it should be possible to just raise them as any gender, because it's just feelings and people can easily get confused about what they are. But science actually does know the answer to this thought experiment, because we did some kind of human experiments in the 60s.
From the 1960s until the late 1970s, it was common for sex reassignment and surgery to be recommended for boys born with a micropenis. This was especially likely if evidence suggested that response to additional testosterone and pubertal testosterone would be poor. With parental acceptance, the boy would be reassigned and renamed as a girl, and surgery performed to remove the testes and construct an artificial vagina. This was based on the now questioned idea that gender identity was shaped entirely from socialization, and that a man with a small penis can find no acceptable place in society. By the mid-1990s, reassignment was less often offered, and all three premises had been challenged. Former subjects of such surgery, vocal about their dissatisfaction with the adult outcome, played a large part in discouraging this practice. Sexual reassignment is rarely performed today for severe micropenis.
We used to sometimes give boys that were born with a micropenis a sex change at birth, gave them a female name, secretly fed them hormones throughout their life, and raised them as girls. They developed the exact same symptoms of gender dysphoria as transgender people, and the exact same thing healed them, letting them live according to their preferred gender. And that's because transgender people and people who have been given a forced sex change are basically the same. Both are in the wrong body and have to live as the wrong gender that does not align with their innate gender identity. Gender dysphoria is caused because the brain innately knows what sex it is supposed to be. And for transgender people, this is caused by the brain having a different sex than the rest of their body. Most of the brain is not sexually dimorphic, meaning that the vast majority of the brain is the same for men and women. But there are some parts, like the one that's responsible for your internal body map and self-recognition, that strongly differ between the sexes. Brain scans consistently show that transgender people were literally born in the wrong body.
Some gray and white matter regions of the brain are sexually dimorphic. Our results show that the white matter microstructure pattern in untreated female-to-male transsexuals is closer to the pattern of subjects who share their gender identity, males, than those who share their biological sex, females. Our results provide evidence for an inherent difference in the brain structure of FTM transsexuals. Finally, the differences between FTM transsexuals and females are seen in all the regions in which males and females differed. A female-sized BSTC was found in male-to-female transsexuals. The size of the BSTC was not influenced by sex hormones in adulthood and was independent of sexual orientation. Our study is the first to show a female brain structure in genetically male transsexuals and supports the hypothesis that gender identity develops as a result of an interaction between the developing brain and sex hormones. Regardless of sexual orientation, men had almost twice as many somatostatin neurons as women. The number of neurons in the BSTC of male-to-female transsexuals was similar to that of the females. In contrast, the neuron number of a female-to-male transsexual was found to be in the male range. Hormone treatment or sex hormone level variations in adulthood did not seem to have influenced BSTC neuron numbers. Present findings of somatostatin neuronal sex differences in the BSTC and its sex reversal in the transsexual brain clearly support the paradigm that in transsexuals sexual differentiation of the brain and genitals may go into opposite directions and point to a neurobiological basis of gender identity disorder. We propose that the sex reversal of the INAH3 in transsexual people is at least partly a marker of an early atypical sexual differentiation of the brain, and that the changes in INAH3 and the BSTC may belong to a complex network that may structurally and functionally be related to gender identity. The study included both adolescent boys and girls with gender dysphoria and used magnetic resonance imaging (MRI) scans to assess brain activation patterns in response to a pheromone known to produce gender-specific activity. Pattern of brain activation in both transgender adolescent boys and girls more closely resembled that of non-transgender boys and girls of their desired gender. In addition, gender dysphoric adolescent girls showed a male-typical brain activation pattern during a visual/spatial memory exercise. Although more research is needed, we now have evidence that sexual differentiation of the brain differs in young people with gender dysphoria, as they show functional brain characteristics that are typical of their desired gender. The observed shift away from a male-typical brain anatomy towards a female-typical one in people who identify as transgender women suggests a possible underlying neuroanatomical correlate for a female gender identity. That is, all transgender women included in this study were confirmed to be genetic males who had not undergone any gender-affirming hormone therapy. Yet, the brain anatomy in the current sample of transgender women is shifted towards their gender identity. These findings add support to the notion that the underlying brain anatomy in transgender people is shifted away from their biological sex towards their gender identity. There exist neurobiological factors that underpin the spectrum of gender identity. Recent anatomical and neuroimaging studies have revealed an association of transsexualism with functional and structural changes of the brain. In addition, the pattern of brain activity in TXs has been demonstrated to substantially overlap with that of their desired genders when they encounter gender-related stimuli, such as visual erotic stimuli or odorous steroids. It has also been demonstrated that transsexualism can be associated with a different cerebral gray matter pattern from that of controls. These findings suggest that brain anatomy may play a role in gender identity.
This research shows that transgender people are evidently not just mentally ill and confused about what they are, but that they accurately describe their biological reality when they state that they were born in the wrong body. Conservatives don't like this idea. Anything more complex than their superficial understanding of basic biology is seen as blasphemous because it clashes with their religious beliefs that God created Adam and Eve. Normal people allow scientific facts to change their understanding of the world, while conservatives base what they call scientific facts on their worldview. They have no problem with twisting science to make it fit to their preconceived notions. So, let us now take a look at one of the loudest voices of the anti-scientific, anti-transgender movement.
The idea behind the transgender movement as a civil rights movement is the idea that all of their problems would just go away if I would pretend that they were the sex to which they claim membership. That's nonsense.
It is nonsense, because it's a strawman argument. No one cares if Ben personally recognizes them as the correct gender, but they do care about having the freedom to express their gender identity and to get access to hormonal treatments and surgery if needed. Transgender people are well aware that bigots exist. They don't care if some religious fundamentalists like Ben Shapiro don't accept reality. It's about them being able to freely express themselves.
The transgender suicide rate is 40%. It is 40%.
Ben really likes to push this 40% number without any context. A short time before this debate, he released an article on Daily Wire where he used a similar number, but as expected from an alt-right grifter, he did so without specifying any sources. Two of these numbers, the 41% of lifetime suicide attempts for transgender people and 4.6% for the general population, are from a study from the UCLA Williams Institute, which I will refer to later again. Ben Shapiro falsely claims
The suicide rate among transgender people who say they are never identified as transgender is still 46%.
even though the actual number given by that study is 36%, but that's not even the worst of his misinterpretations.
45% of transgender people who undergo hormone therapy attempt suicide, higher than the general transgender suicide rate.
He makes it sound as if hormone treatment increased their suicide attempt rate, even though the logical explanation is that those with stronger gender dysphoria and higher suicidality are more likely to receive hormonal treatment. In reality, hormone therapy drastically lowers the suicide attempt rate, but Ben was only looking at lifetime attempts, which obviously include attempts before starting the treatment, so this number alone does not tell you anything about the effectiveness of this therapy.
Researchers found a 60% decrease in moderate and severe depression and 73% decrease in suicidality among transgender and non-binary youth who received puberty blockers or gender-affirming hormones over a 12-month period.
But Ben's arguments in this article get so much worse.
A 2011 Swedish study looked at mortality and morbidity after gender reassignment surgery and found that people who changed genders had a higher risk of suicide. The sex-reassigned persons had substantially higher rates of death from cardiovascular disease and suicide, and substantially higher rates of attempted suicide. Gender surgery is not effective treatment for depression, anxiety, or mental disorders.
I've zoomed into the dots because he left out an important piece of that sentence.
Persons with transsexualism after sex reassignment have considerably higher risks for mortality, suicidal behavior, and psychiatric morbidity than the general population.
By leaving out the key fact that this study only compared the rates to the general population, but not before and after getting surgery, Ben Shapiro disingenuously makes it sound as if getting surgery led to an increase in suicide attempts.
After sex reassignment surgery, the suicide attempt rate dropped significantly from 29.3% to 5.1%. However, gender transition for those that wanted it was shown to drastically reduce instances of suicidal ideation and suicide attempt, highlighting the important role played by social transition and gender reassignment in improving quality of life and overall well-being amongst respondents. The scholarly literature makes clear that gender transition is effective in treating gender dysphoria and can significantly improve the well-being of transgender individuals. Among the positive outcomes of gender transition and related medical treatments for transgender individuals are improved quality of life, greater relationship satisfaction, higher self-esteem and confidence, and reductions in anxiety, depression, suicidality, and substance use. Through treatment, the group was no longer gender dysphoric. The vast majority functioned quite well psychologically, socially, and sexually. The results substantiate previous conclusions that sex reassignment is effective. After gender reassignment, in young adulthood, the gender dysphoria was alleviated and psychological functioning had steadily improved. Well-being was similar to or better than same-age young adults from the general population. We systematically reviewed the literature to determine the benefits of hormonal therapies given to individuals with gender identity disorder as a part of sex reassignment. We found 28 studies with fairly long follow-up duration that demonstrated improvements in gender dysphoria, psychological functioning and comorbidities, lower suicide rates, higher sexual satisfaction, and overall improvement in the quality of life. Additionally, participants in the present study reported a significantly lower frequency of non-suicidal self-injury and suicidal thoughts and behaviors after initiating the gender affirmation process, as compared to before beginning the gender affirmation process. A finding that aligns with prior research conducted in the US and Europe. Socially transitioned transgender children reported depression and self-worth that did not differ from their matched control or sibling peers, and they reported marginally higher anxiety. Compared with national averages, socially transitioned transgender children showed typical rates of depression and marginally higher rates of anxiety. The initial complaint and symptom called gender dysphoria, essential to the diagnosis of gender identity disorder, had virtually disappeared after the transition. The distress and impairment in social, occupational, and other important areas as a result of the gender dysphoria appeared to have vanished. During the interviews, the subjects emphasized that even after all these years, they felt themselves more real, happier, and more confident in their own possibilities compared to before sex reassignment surgery. The subjects proclaimed an overall positive change in their family and social life. None of them showed any regrets about the SRS.
This leads me to the next point in Ben's article, where he massively exaggerates the regret rates.
The study commissioned by The Guardian of the UK in 2004 reviewed 100 studies and found 20% regret.
As expected, this over 20-year-old article doesn't provide us with any helpful sources to verify that claim and to get more context about what they actually regret.
The authors concluded that in this 30-year period, under 1% of female to males and 1 to 1.5% of male to females experienced persistent regret following sex reassignment surgery. Studies published since 1991 have reported a decrease in the incidence of regret for both MTFs and FTMs that is likely due to improved quality of psychological and surgical care for individuals undergoing sex reassignment. The findings suggest that youth accessing puberty blockers and hormones as part of gender-affirming care tend to be satisfied with and not regretful of that care several years later. Comparing regret after gender-affirming surgery to regret after plastic surgery operations and other major life decisions is a novel approach that can provide insight into the magnitude of this issue. When comparing regret after gas to regret after other surgeries and major life decisions, the percentage of patients experiencing regret is extremely low. Regret after gender-affirming surgery is less than 1%. Of the 3,398 patients who had appointments during this period, 0.47%, expressed transition-related regret or detransitioned. Study findings are consistent with previous research showing low rates of detransition. Detransition was most often prompted by social difficulties rather than changes in gender identity or physical complications and was most often temporary. Only 3 patients made a long-term detransition. A total of 27 studies, pooling 7,928 transgender patients who underwent any type of gender affirmation surgery, were included. Pooled prevalence of regret after GAS was 1%. The most prevalent reason for regret was the difficulty/dissatisfaction/acceptance in life with the new gender role. Other less prevalent reasons were failure of surgery to achieve their surgical goals in an aesthetic level and psychological level. Based on this review, there is an extremely low prevalence of regret in transgender patients after gender affirmation surgery. Positive impact of gender transition on transgender well-being has grown considerably in recent years, as both surgical techniques and social support have improved. Regrets following gender transition are extremely rare and have become even rarer as both surgical techniques and social support have improved. Pooling data from numerous studies demonstrates a regret rate ranging from 0.3% to 3.8%. Regrets are most likely to result from a lack of social support after transition or poor surgical outcomes using older techniques.
In reality, regret is very rare and I couldn't find any actually scientific sources that were in any way even close to the 20% number that he reported. As usual, actual scientific facts paint a completely different picture than the alternative facts that Ben Shapiro creates by selectively ignoring all the studies that would have debunked his preconceived notions.
And according to the Anderson School at UCLA,
he quotes an unnamed study from the Anderson School of Management. He is deliberately opaque with the studies he pretends to cite because he is just pretending to care about facts. I couldn't find any related studies released by this School of Management, but I'm pretty sure that he mixed it up with the Williams Institute, which actually conducts research on LGBT topics. And as expected, none of the relevant sources I could find from this institute support his following argument.
it makes no difference. There's a study that came out last year. It makes no difference, virtually no difference, statistically speaking, as to whether people recognize you as a transgender person or not, which suggests there's a very high comorbidity between transgenderism, whatever that mental state may be, and suicidality.
As he doesn't give us any hints that would help us to fact-check his claim, for example by giving us the name of the study or by providing us with accurate information on the institute that released it, I can only guess that he probably meant this study. It fits into the time frame he gave and mentions keywords like recognized or recognition. But the actual findings of this study are like the polar opposite of what he claims.
A lower than average prevalence of lifetime suicide attempts was found among respondents who said their family relationships had remained strong after coming out. In contrast, the prevalence of suicide attempts was elevated among respondents who reported experiencing rejection, disruption, or abuse by family members or close friends because of anti-transgender bias. Two interrelated risk factors appear to be most strongly related to suicidal behavior among transgender and gender nonconforming adults: rejection, discrimination, victimization, and violence related to anti-transgender bias, and serious mental health conditions. In this study, we found a markedly high prevalence of lifetime suicide attempts among respondents who reported experiencing stressors related to anti-transgender bias.
This can also be seen in other sources.
While LGBTQ+ youth reported their levels of access to an affirming home or affirming school or supportive community varied by state, these factors were universally associated with lower rates of suicidal thoughts and attempts, as well as lower rates of anxiety and depression. Each category of adult and peer gender identity acceptance was associated with lower odds of a past year suicide attempt, with the strongest associations within each individual category being acceptance from parents and other family members. The transgender and non-binary youth who reported gender identity acceptance from at least one adult had 1/3 lower odds of reporting a past year suicide attempt, and acceptance from at least one peer was also associated with lower odds of a past year suicide attempt.
That has nothing to do with how society treats
Do you think it could be because of they're bullied at school?
No, I don't think that. I do not think that the discrepancy. I do not think the discrepancy. First of all, I'm against bullying of any sort. Okay, the idea that somebody would beat somebody up is terrible. Okay, as somebody who's viciously bullied in high school, I'm not a fan of bullying. But the idea that the normal suicide rate across the United States is 4%. The suicide rate in the transgender community is 40%. The idea that 36% more transgender people are committing suicide because people are mean to them is ridiculous. It's not true, and it's not backed by any science that anyone can cite. It is pure conjecture.
Just one sentence earlier, he pretended to cite this study, which mentions discrimination and victimization as key factors. No one is claiming that bullying is the only contributing factor, but he also ignores that his own source shows that transgender victims of bullying have a significantly higher suicide attempt rate. I'm really not surprised that he got bullied, but I'm constantly surprised why anyone would unironically listen to him.
You can't sacrifice truth because some people are going to actually suffer because of the truth. Plus, there's no evidence whatsoever that the suicide rate would go down in the transgender community in any marked way if people just started pretending that men were women and women were men. We're trying that experiment now. We'll find out whether it works. So far, no evidence.
He just claims that there is no evidence because he conveniently ignores any scientific facts that hurt his biased feelings while deliberately misinterpreting the few sources he cherry-picked. In this video, I've shown a lot of studies that were released years before he held this debate, so if he actually cared about facts, he could have learned that allowing transgender people to live as their preferred gender drastically reduces their suicide rate.
Those with high levels of social support were significantly less likely to attempt suicide than those with little support, 2% versus 16%. Strong parental support for one's gender identity or expression was associated with significantly lower past-year prevalences of both suicidal consideration and attempts. Those experiencing high levels of transphobia were more likely to consider suicide than those experiencing low levels. Among those who experienced transphobic physical or sexual violence, 56% had seriously considered suicide in the past year and 29% attempted. This contrasts with 28% and 4% respectively among those who experienced no transphobic assault, harassment, or threats. Thus, those who had experienced transphobic physical or sexual violence were 7 times more likely to have attempted suicide in the past year. Finally, medical transition status was significantly associated with suicidality. Those planning or in process of medically transitioning sex also had very high prevalences of past-year attempts, 27% and 18% respectively, each significantly higher than prevalences of attempts in the other two groups. 1% among those who completed medical transition and 3% among those not planning a transition or for whom the concept did not apply. Interventions to increase social inclusion and access to medical transition and to reduce transphobia have the potential to contribute to substantial reductions in the extremely high prevalences of suicide ideation and attempts within trans populations. Our findings support a strong effect for social exclusion, discrimination, and lack of medical transition, for those needing it, on suicide ideation and attempts, and potentially on the survival of trans persons. Finally, we found that among those reporting a need to medically transition through hormones and/or surgeries, suicidality was substantially reduced among those who had completed a medical transition. There are clear links between family acceptance in adolescence and health status in young adulthood. Young adults who reported high levels of family acceptance scored higher on all three measures of positive adjustment and health: self-esteem, social support, and general health. For the measures of negative health outcomes, young adults who reported low levels of family acceptance had scores that were significantly worse for depression, substance abuse, and suicidal ideation and attempts. Half as many participants from highly accepting families reported suicidal thoughts in the past 6 months compared with those who reported low acceptance.
Or that mere acceptance changes the extraordinarily high suicidal ideation rates. In fact, there was a study from the Trevor Project that recently came out, and it looked at social acceptance in families, and what it found is that 40% of trans kids, or minors who identify as transgender, are still experiencing suicidal ideation, which suggests to me that this is not merely a question of people are being mean to people who are trans. Our society, as an overall affect, is much more accepting of people who consider themselves trans than it was, say, 10 years ago. The suicidal ideation rates remain precisely the same. They have not changed overall.
Ben Shapiro really likes to falsely insist that the number does not change, even if it requires him to just straight up lie about what his own source states. As usual, he is not giving us any information that would help us to fact-check his claim, but all the relevant studies from the Trevor Project directly debunk his argument. There is this one that fits to his given time frame, where the title itself already tells us that acceptance from parents reduces the suicide ideation rate.
LGBTQ youth who report having at least one accepting adult were 40% less likely to report a suicide attempt in the past year.
Transphobes don't care about scientific facts. Never have, never will. They just like to pretend that their hateful feelings are supported by science to give themselves a false veneer of credibility. They are actually just bigots that are immune to facts and that are completely unwilling to educate themselves. People that vote for right-wing parties due to their anti-transgender stance are ghouls. They don't have a heart or brain. They willingly vote for parties that are actively evil because they think that hurting other people will magically make their own sad lives better.